There's a moment in every person's life when they realize they've been playing the wrong game entirely. Not losing. Not winning. Just playing the wrong game. Mine came on a Tuesday morning in October. Inside a glass-walled boardroom on the 14th floor of a building I owned. My stepdaughter Diana didn't know that last part yet. But she was about to. My name is Carol. I'm 64 years old, and for the past 22 years, I was known in our corner of Columbus, Ohio as exactly one thing. Richard Hargrove's wife. The schoolteacher he married after Diana's mother passed. The quiet woman who packed lunches and graded papers and never seemed to want much of anything for herself. That was the story everyone believed. It wasn't exactly wrong. I did pack lunches. I did grade papers. I loved those years in the classroom more than I can explain. But before all of that, before Richard, before Columbus, before the cozy house on Elmwood Drive with the yellow shutters Richard painted himself one summer, I was someone else entirely. I'll get to that. First, let me tell you about Richard. Richard Hargrove built Hargrove Industrial Supply from a single warehouse in 1987 into a mid-size regional powerhouse that employed over 340 people by the time I met him. He was the kind of businessman who knew every employee's name, who remembered birthdays, who drove a 10-year-old Ford pickup because he said it kept him honest. He was also the kind of father who had spent 15 years quietly cleaning up after a daughter who never quite learned that the world didn't owe her anything. Diana was 19 when I married her father. Dark-haired, sharp-featured, beautiful in the way of someone who knows it and uses it. She had her mother's cheekbones and her father's intelligence. But somewhere along the way she'd acquired something neither of them possessed. A belief that she was simply owed more than other people. From the very beginning, Diana made her position clear. She didn't scream or throw things. She was too smart for that. She simply excluded me. Family photographs taken when I happened to step away. Holiday plans made and shared with her father before I was mentioned. Conversations that stopped when I walked into rooms. She called me Carol. Never anything warmer. And she said it the way you'd say the name of an appliance. Not cruel exactly. Just indifferent. Precisely calibrated to remind me of what I was to her. A temporary inconvenience she was waiting out. Richard saw it. He wasn't blind. But he'd lost Diana's mother to cancer when Diana was only 11. And the guilt of a widowed father runs deep. He compensated. He excused. He gave her things she hadn't earned and overlooked behavior he shouldn't have. He gave her a vice presidency at the company when she was 27. A title she held without ever quite understanding what it meant to actually run something. I watched all of this. I said very little. Because I understood something about love that Diana didn't. Sometimes you protect people by staying quiet. And sometimes you protect yourself the exact same way. Richard got his diagnosis in the spring of his 68th year. Parkinson's. Not the slow, gentle kind. The aggressive, relentless kind that rearranges a person's world in months rather than years. He handled it the way he handled everything. Practically. Deliberately. Without self-pity. Within weeks of his diagnosis, he sat down with me at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd had 22 years of Sunday breakfasts, and slid a yellow notepad across to me. I need you to understand everything, he said. Not just the bank accounts. Everything. We spent 6 months going through it all. Every asset, every holding, every contract, every piece of real estate the company owned or leased. And as we worked through it together, Richard slowly began to understand something that surprised him. His wife, the schoolteacher, knew exactly what she was looking at. Because here's what Diana never bothered to find out about me. Before I was Carol Hargrove, I was Carol Eames. And before I was a 5th grade teacher in Columbus, Ohio, I spent 11 years as a real estate and corporate transactions attorney in Chicago. I left when my first marriage ended and my mother got sick and I needed a quieter life. Teaching gave me that. It gave me joy in a way the law never quite had. And when I met Richard at a school fundraiser where he donated a very generous check, I was happy enough as a teacher that I didn't feel the need to announce my previous life to anyone. Richard knew. Of course Richard knew. We didn't have secrets from each other. But Diana? Diana never asked. In 22 years. She never once asked me a single question about who I'd been before I married her father. That was her first mistake. As Richard's condition progressed, we made decisions together. Careful decisions. Documented decisions. One of those decisions involved the building. Hargrove Industrial's main office sat inside a 14-story commercial building in downtown Columbus. Richard had leased space there for years. But the building itself had come available for purchase in 2019. The owner was aging, the price was right, and Richard wanted to buy it. But Richard's name on a major asset acquisition while his diagnosis was known, created complications. Legal complications. The kind that could affect company valuation and trigger certain clauses in existing investor agreements. So we structured it differently. The building was purchased through a separate LLC, a holding entity with one member. Me. It was entirely legal. Entirely documented. Our estate attorney, our accountant, and our financial advisor all had copies. Richard paid for it from his personal assets. Yes. But it was structured, deliberately and properly, with my name on the deed. Diana knew about the building. She just never thought to ask who owned it. Richard passed on a Thursday in November. 2 years after his diagnosis. It was early morning, the light just starting to come through the bedroom curtains. He'd had a good week, and then a hard night. And then he was simply gone. I held his hand for a long time after. Diana arrived at the house 4 hours later. She didn't call first. She came with her boyfriend Marcus, who'd been working at the company for 3 years in a role that had expanded considerably since he and Diana started dating. And she walked through the front door the way someone walks through a door they believe they're about to inherit. I was still in my robe. I hadn't slept. Richard had been gone for less than half a day. She asked me about the will before she asked me how I was doing. I told her I wasn't prepared to discuss anything that day. She told me I should prepare. I closed the door and went back to sit with my grief. And I made a decision in that moment that I held onto for the next 4 months. I was going to do this right. I was going to do this completely. And I wasn't going to be rushed by someone who'd shown up 4 hours after my husband died to talk about money. The will reading happened 3 weeks later at our estate attorney's office. Richard had been thoughtful and precise. Because he was always thoughtful and precise. He left Diana $400 outright. A sum that would have been meaningful to most people. He left her his grandfather's watch and his mother's china and the vacation property in Gatlinburg that she'd always loved. He left the business, the operating company, its inventory, its contracts, its employees, its reputation, in a trust administered jointly by me and the company's CFO, with instructions for an orderly transition to professional management within 18 months. Diana's vice presidency was not mentioned in the will. That oversight, or rather, that very deliberate choice, was the match that lit everything on fire. She hired an attorney before the week was out. I heard about it from our CFO, Gary, who'd worked for Richard for 18 years and had the kind of loyalty that doesn't require instruction. He called me on a Saturday morning and told me that Diana had been into the office. That she'd told the senior management team she was taking over. That her father had always intended her to run the company. And that the trust arrangement was being challenged as a product of my undue influence over a man whose illness had compromised his judgment. I listened quietly. Then I asked Gary to schedule a full board meeting for the following Tuesday at 10 a.m. "Should I tell Diana?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Tell her I'd like her there." I spent the weekend preparing. Not emotionally. I'd done my emotional preparation in the quiet of the house we'd shared, surrounded by 22 years of a life that was real and earned and worth defending. I prepared legally. I pulled every document, every deed, every LLC filing, every corporate resolution Richard and I had executed together. I reviewed the trust instrument line by line. I researched Ohio case law on undue influence in the context of business succession planning. I built a file that would have made my former managing partner at the Chicago firm proud. And at the bottom of that file, I placed one document: the deed to the building. Tuesday morning arrived clear and cold. I dressed carefully. Not in a simple dress this time. I wore the charcoal blazer I'd kept in the back of the closet for years, the one from my Chicago days that still fit perfectly, and I carried the leather briefcase Richard had given me on our 10th anniversary. He'd had it monogrammed. CEH. Carol Eames Hargrove. Both of us. In one set of initials. The boardroom on the 14th floor seated 16. When I arrived, 12 of those seats were filled. Gary at the far end, the department heads, 2 outside advisors whose presence I'd requested. Diana sat to the left of the head chair with Marcus beside her and a man I didn't recognize on her other side. Her attorney, I assumed. Young. Confident in the way of someone who hasn't lost enough cases yet. Diana looked at me when I entered the way she'd been looking at me for 22 years. Like I was in the wrong room. I sat at the head of the table. She didn't like that. Gary opened the meeting, briefly summarizing the trust arrangement and the purpose of the gathering. Before he'd finished his second sentence, Diana's attorney raised his hand. "If I may," he said, "my client has asked that we address the question of Mrs. Hargrove's authority in this matter before we proceed to any other business." I folded my hands on the table and waited. Diana stood. She was good at this. I'll give her that. She'd been watching her father run meetings since she was a teenager. And she'd absorbed the surface of it. The eye contact, the measured pace, the performative confidence. "My father built this company," she said, looking around the room at people who'd watched her grow up. "He built it for his family. For me. The trust arrangement you're referring to was created during the final stages of his illness. When he was on significant medication and under constant influence from his wife. Carol Hargrove has no background in business, no operational experience, and frankly no legal right to sit at the head of this table or make decisions about this company's future." She looked at me then. Directly. The way she'd been wanting to look at me for 22 years. "She is, and has always been, just a teacher." The room was very quiet. I reached down, unlatched my briefcase, removed a single document, and slid it across the table toward Diana. "I own this building," I said. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. The kind you can feel against your skin. Diana looked at the document. Then at me. Then at her attorney. Her attorney picked it up. "Read it." Set it down slowly. Marcus leaned over to look and didn't say a word. "What is this?" Diana asked, and her voice had changed. Something had gone out of it. "It's the deed to this building," I said. "Recorded October 14, 2019. Owner of record, Eames Property Holdings LLC. Sole member, Carol Eames Hargrove." I paused. "Your father and I structured the acquisition together, Diana. It was legally executed, properly documented, and has been on file with Franklin County since the day it closed." "That can't be right." "Your company," I said, "pays rent to my LLC. Has for 5 years. The lease is in your own financial records if you'd like to verify it. She turned to her attorney with the expression of someone who has just realized they built their entire strategy on sand. He was flipping through papers on his tablet, his confidence visibly deflating with every second. Furthermore, I said, reaching back into my briefcase and producing a second document, I'd like to introduce myself properly to those of you who may not know my background. I slid copies down both sides of the table. Before I married Richard, I spent 11 years as a real estate and corporate transactions attorney at Eames & Caldwell in Chicago. I am a current member of both the Illinois and Ohio state bars. I have been co-trustee of this company's succession trust since it was executed. And I drafted significant portions of that instrument myself. The room had the quality of a held breath. Gary was looking at me with an expression I can only describe as grateful. Diana was looking at me like she was seeing me for the first time. My husband knew exactly what he was doing, I said, and my voice was steady in a way I was grateful for. He was not confused. He was not manipulated. He was a careful, intelligent man who spent 2 years planning for the future of the company he'd spent a lifetime building. He wanted it protected. He wanted his employees protected. And yes, he wanted me protected. Not because I couldn't protect myself, but because that's what people do when they love someone. Diana's attorney cleared his throat. Mrs. Hargrove, I think we may need to request a recess to review. Of course, I said. Diana said nothing. She was still looking at the deed. The recess lasted 40 minutes. I sat in Richard's old office, my office now, I supposed, and drank coffee from the machine in the break room and looked out at the Columbus skyline and thought about all the mornings Richard had sat in this same chair looking at this same view. Gary knocked and came in after about 20 minutes. You doing okay? He asked. I'm fine, I said. How's the room? Her attorney's on the phone with someone senior at his firm. He paused. Diana hasn't moved. I nodded. Carol, Gary said carefully, how long have you known about all this? The bar membership, the LLC, all of it? Always, I said. I just wasn't performing it. When we reconvened, Diana's attorney made a brief statement. He acknowledged that his review of the property records and trust documents confirmed their validity. He acknowledged that the allegations of undue influence would be, quote, difficult to sustain given Mrs. Hargrove's professional background and documented involvement in the estate planning process. And he recommended to his client that a different approach might be in her best interest. Diana sat through all of this without speaking. When her attorney finished, she looked at me across the table. And for the first time in 22 years, I saw something in her face that wasn't contempt or indifference. I saw confusion. Genuine, undefended confusion. But I wasn't finished. Before we close this meeting, I said, I need to address one additional matter. I reached into my briefcase for the third time. Diana, 3 years ago, you authorized a series of vendor payments through your division totaling $218. The vendor is registered in Nevada. The company has never received the services those payments were issued for. The color left her face so quickly it was like watching a light switch off. Our outside auditor, I nodded toward one of the 2 advisors I'd invited, has been reviewing the company's accounts for the past 3 weeks at my request. His preliminary findings suggest that the Nevada vendor shares a registered agent address with an LLC in Marcus's name. Marcus pushed back from the table. I'd suggest you stay seated, I said quietly. The auditor has already shared his findings with the Franklin County District Attorney's Office. I imagine someone will want to speak with both of you in the very near future. Diana's attorney put his pen down. Mrs. Hargrove, he said carefully, my client and I will need to speak privately. Of course, I said. The conference room at the end of the hall is available. I paused. Tell your client to think carefully about what she wants her next move to be. Her father gave her $400 and a property in Gatlinburg and 22 years of a father's love she mostly chose not to accept. That is still hers. What happens next is entirely up to her. The meeting adjourned. The fraud investigation moved quickly once the district attorney's office got involved. Marcus cooperated almost immediately. The kind of cooperation that comes from someone who was more opportunist than criminal and understood exactly how bad his odds were. His testimony confirmed what the audit had found. Diana had authorized the payments. She'd known where the money was going. It hadn't been her idea exactly, but she'd signed off. And in the eyes of the law, that was enough. She accepted a plea agreement 3 months later. Restitution of the full $218, 5 years of probation, and a permanent bar from serving as an officer or director of any Ohio corporation. The vice presidency she'd fought to inherit was already gone. I visited her once, about 2 weeks before her sentencing. She was staying in the Gatlinburg property, the one her father had left her. And the drive down from Columbus gave me a long time to think about what I wanted to say. She met me at the door looking like someone who'd been through a year's worth of consequences in 3 months. Thinner. Quieter. The sharp edges worn down to something that looked, for the first time, almost approachable. We sat on the back porch with coffee and looked at the mountains and didn't say anything useful for a while. "Why did you come?" she finally asked. "Because your father would have wanted someone to," I said. She nodded. Stared into her cup. "I didn't know about the law thing," she said. "About Chicago. About any of it." "I know," I said. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I thought about that for a moment. "Because you never asked," I said. "And because it didn't seem like it mattered to you who I'd been. What mattered to you was that I wasn't her." Diana looked at me then. Really looked at me, the way she'd looked at me in that boardroom right before everything shifted. "I'm sorry," she said. "For all of it. Not just the company stuff. For all of it." I believed her. Not because people always mean what they say in moments of consequence, but because grief has a way of stripping everything down to what's actually true. And Diana had lost her father and her career and her sense of herself in the span of about 4 months. There wasn't much left to perform. "Your father loved you," I told her. "He was disappointed in you sometimes. But he never stopped loving you. That $400 wasn't a consolation prize. It was him saying he trusted you to build something real if you had a foundation to start from." She cried then. Quietly, looking at the mountains. I let her. I drove back to Columbus as the sun went down behind the ridge. And I thought about what it means to carry a life inside you that other people don't see. Richard had known. He'd always known. And he'd loved me not despite what I'd been but because of it. Because the woman who could have been in Chicago courtrooms had chosen Sunday breakfasts and yellow shutters and a grieving man's family instead. That choice was never a diminishment. It was the most powerful thing I ever did. The company stabilized under professional management within the timeline the trust specified. Gary stayed on as CFO. The employees kept their jobs. Hargrove Industrial Supply is still running today, carrying Richard's name forward the way he would have wanted. My LLC renewed the building lease at favorable terms. I went back to teaching. Part-time, now, at a community college. Contract law and property transactions for a new generation of students who don't yet know how much they don't know. I tell them on the first day of every semester the same thing. The most dangerous assumption you can make about another person is that you already know their story. Diana sent me a card at Christmas. A simple one, no flourish. Just her handwriting in blue ink. "Thank you for coming to Gatlinburg. I think about what you said. D." It's on the refrigerator now. Next to a photo of Richard and me in Venice. The summer we went for our 15th anniversary. He's laughing at something I said. I can't remember what. But I remember the sound of it. I'll always remember the sound of it. They thought they knew who I was. They thought they could walk into a boardroom and erase 22 years with a single sentence. What they didn't know, what Diana never thought to ask, was that the quiet woman who packed lunches and graded papers had spent 11 years learning exactly how to protect everything she loved. And when the moment came, she was ready. And that was just the beginning. Because what happened next? 3 weeks after that boardroom meeting, I never saw coming. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.